and thank you for inviting me. Today I'll present this paper, To Constrain to Grow, analysis of firms' response to the alleviation of skill shortages. And please know that this is very much a work in progress, so any comment or suggestion you may have are very much welcome. So let me start with some motivation. This paper relates to the topical issue of the future of work. And there's been a lot of debate about this. We know, for example, that 30% of jobs are likely to change radically in the next 20 years. And a lot of the literature has been focusing on what happens to workers that have this sort of skills that are becoming obsolete. But then on the other side of the medal, you have a demand for some skills that is growing faster than the supply, which creates skill shortages in the labor markets. So there are a few potential solutions that have been proposed by the literature. The first one is the adaptation of the school system or the development of lifelong learning. But the one I'm going to be focusing on today is the one that focuses on encouraging immigration of high-skilled workers that possess these rare competencies. And there are several examples of such policies in different countries of the world. One that has been studied a lot is the H-1B visa system in the US. But at the same time, in Canada, you have a visa point system. And the one I'm going to analyze today is a reform that was introduced in France, where there is a list of tight occupations, so occupations that are facing skill shortages, and where immigration is encouraged. So the objective of this paper is first to check how firms react when their skills constraints are relaxed, which in turn give us some information about what are the costs that are associated with the skill shortages in the first place. And then secondly, the second question that I'm addressing is whether there are any positive spillovers associated with immigration of these workers that have rare skills. So for example, is there any crowding in of other types of employment? Do we find any productivity gains? And for instance, a reduction in spatial inequality. So the literature on this has been quite prolific, especially in recent years. The first trend on the literature that I'm talking to is the one of the role of frictions in the labor market. And more in recent years, there are papers showing that frictions are very important determinants of employment, wages, firm performance, etc. And also there is this whole debate of skill shortages in a context of skill mismatch. So you can have unemployment and at the same time have shortages in other types of occupation. And the second strand of the literature is the one of the externalities that are associated with high-skill migration. There are quite a few papers that came out in recent years on the effect of this high-skill migration on firm performance. One of them by Dorn and co-authors that look at basically mostly on H-1B visa, what happens where you have all these migrants coming into the countries? Is there any substitution with the native labor, and what is the effect on productivity? And here, many papers tend to find some positive effect on productivity, but not all of them. For example, Doran find that there is more substitution with local labor and not so great effects on productivity. And then finally, there are a few papers that try to look at the complementarities at play and how an influx of migrants can change the technologies that are used by the firms, and also how it affects demand for other types of labor inputs. For example, there is this paper by Lewis in 2011 that shows that cities in the US that received important waves of low-skilled migrants, they were adopting less automation technologies. So there is this effect also on the technologies that are chosen by the firms. So with this paper, I would take advantage of a reform that relaxes constraints within a specific list of occupation. So it will give me some quasi-natural experimental variation. This is one of a rare setting that allows to measure the costs that are associated with such frictions. And then finally I try to propose a thorough evaluation of the effectiveness of one of the selective immigration policies, exactly by looking at the impact on on helping firms, which was basically the objective of the reform in the first place. So before getting into details of the characteristics of the reform and my evaluation strategy, let me just give you a brief preview of my results. I do find that firms that were constrained by this list of occupations that are relaxed increase employment in reform jobs after the reform, and they do this by hiring more migrants, which is exactly what we expect. So this is my first stage, and in a second stage I look at what happens at firm output, and I do find positive effects on firm size, revenues, and value added. On the other hand, no, I do not detect any effect, neither on capital stock nor on productivity. Interestingly, there seems to be some crowding in of other types of labor inputs, and this one seems to be concentrated among high-skilled jobs. So this non-tight high-skilled job seems to be rather complementary to the occupations that are targeted by the reform. And finally, when I look at some of the heterogeneity dimension, I find that less dynamic labor markets seems to benefit more, which may lead to a positive effect, to a reduction in spatial inequality through a positive effect on productivity in these particular areas. So if there are no clarification questions so far, I'm gonna give you some more details about the reform that I'm looking at. So this is just a diagram that shows you the procedure that a French employer has to go through when he wants to hire a foreign worker. And the main point being here is that it's very long and complicated. And here, when I'm talking about foreign workers, I mean non-European workers, of course, because there is the common market in Europe, and so there are no restrictions for hiring an European worker. But if a French employer wants to make an offer to a foreign workers outside the EU, it will have to go through this very long procedure. The official processing time is set to 2 months, but then there are quite a few reports that say that it can take much longer in practice. So you can understand that this can be a discouragement, quite large element of discouragement for employers to go through the full thing. So in red, I've circled the 2 procedures that are eased by the reform that I'm looking at. The first one is that the first step, in a first step, the employer has to ask the employment office in France, Pôle emploi, for authorization, and to get authorization, he has to prove to have been looking extensively for a native candidate. So there is this resident or native preference that has to be respected. Only after showing that for several weeks or months, the employer has been searching without success for a native candidate, the employment office give him the authorization to make an offer to a foreign worker. And once this is done, the employer has to find a suitable foreign worker candidate. And then there is a whole set of checks that are put in place. For example, they check whether the education of this candidate is in line with the occupation for which he is employed. They check whether the wage that is offered is in line with all the sectoral and branch agreements in terms of wages. And then the thing that is going to be affected by the reform is that this particular occupation needs to figure as in a situation of tightness in the particular labor market. So again, the Service of Foreign Labor will have to ask the employment office again to check whether in this particular moment this occupation is in a situation of labor market tightness. And only in case yes, only then it gives the authorization. So basically, these reforms that I'm looking at, which is introduced in 2008, abolishes these 2 requirements. The first one, the proof of extensive search for a resident candidate, and the second one, the certification of high level of tightness from the employment office. The list is introduced in 2008, but unchanged up to today. So the exact same occupations are still in the list today. There was a minor change in 2011 where the list was restrained by half. But for some procedural mistakes that were made, it was invalidated in 2012. So basically, just for 1 year, it was shrunk by half, but in 2012, it went back to the exact same occupation that they were there before. And in total, we're talking about 30 occupations, all of them chosen because they're characterized by high level of tightness. So if you want to just have an idea here, I'm plotting for 3 different broad categories of occupations. Executives and engineers on the top left, on the top right you have technicians and foremen, and on the bottom you have blue collar. And in blue, what is graphed there is the tightness indicator, which basically measures the ratio between the offers, the vacancies that are open in this occupation, and the number of available job seekers that are qualified for these jobs. So the higher this ratio, the higher the level of tightness. And you see that in these occupations in blue, the level of tightness was higher than in other occupation of the same categories throughout since 1997, basically, especially for executives and engineers and technician and foremen. But this gap actually widens quite a lot during the years preceding the reform. So you see that there is a growing demand for these jobs that is not followed by supply. And that justifies basically why these jobs were included in the list. So if you want to know a little bit more about which type of occupations we're talking about, there are 30 of them. This is just a subset. There are different kinds, but most of them enter into the broad category of technicians and foremen. So we're talking about fairly technical jobs that mostly require post-secondary vocational education. So for example, we have some in the service sector, sales technician, sales representative for intermediate goods, but many of them are also in industry. For example, a technician of industrial planning, draftsman, manager of mechanical construction, etc. So these are fairly specialized jobs that require some specific skills. We have a few occupations that are high skills, so in the executive engineers group. And in particular, you have these computer scientists and senior computer scientists that were quite present, basically we have some reports that say that employers use this reform typically to take advantage and hire more computer scientists. And then finally, you also have some blue-collar, specialized blue-collar workers, such as operators of glass production, installation drivers, etc. So this is just some descriptive statistics showing you how much of the total private sector employment are we talking about. And before the reform, these occupations in total accounted for about 10.5% of the French labor market in the private sector. And this share seemed to have increased quite a bit after 2008, and it reached up to 11.5% by 2012 and 13. So of course, there are a lot of things happening in this period, and among other things, the economic financial crisis, which hit France mostly in 2009. But still, this gives us a little bit of a first impression that something has happened, in a sense that the share of these jobs in the labor market have substantially increased after the introduction of this reform. Any questions up to this point? If not, I'll just continue to the empirical strategy. So the data that I'm going to use basically comes from two administrative sources. The first one is the Declaration of Fiscal Data between 2005 and 2013. And this data gives me the full occupational distribution and wage structure of all workers in the French private sector at the establishment level. So within every establishment, which I can follow through time, I know exactly what specific occupations compose the labor force of the establishment and the wage of every individual. And then this, yeah.
Sorry if I interrupt. There is one clarifying question. Is the following: are those occupations in the list strategically rather than randomly selected by government? The government foresaw the benefit of relaxing these constraints for the firms?
Yeah, no, so they're definitely not randomly selected. They're selected based on the level of labor market tightness. So the graph that I showed you before, basically labor market tightness in each occupation is measured by taking the ratio between the available vacancies and the available unemployed workers with the right competencies. And the aim of the government was really to help employer hire in these occupations that were facing skill shortages. So indeed, the jobs that are selected in there are clearly not random, but really the jobs for which there is a lack of native labor force. So there are not enough people in the labor market qualified for these jobs, and that's why the government tried to help firms by making the process of hiring a foreign worker faster or easier, let's say.
Thanks.
Yeah, so this is the first part, is this declaration of fiscal data, and I'm going to merge to that the second administrative data set, which is the declaration of accounting and performance data. And this one, of course, for the same use, gives me information on the performance of the firms. So I have sales, revenues, value added, capital stock, everything at the firm level. So since the first one is at the establishment level and the second one is at the larger, at the firm, I will only keep in my sample mono-establishment firms, and further I also have to drop establishments that have less than 20 employees, because for them the occupations are not well defined over the first part of the period. So in the end, my sample is going to keep all the mono-establishment firms that have more than 20 employees that are in the French private sector, except for the financial institution for which we don't have the accounting data. So the performance data is not collected for them. And in addition to this main data set, I have the employment office data that gives me this level of tightness at the level of occupation cross regions. And this is exactly the data that was used in order to define the list. So as I said, occupations in the list are selected because they're in a high tightness situation, measured as the ratio between the number of vacancies and the number of qualified job seekers. But the policymakers use this as the main indicator, but also use several other ones, such as the volume of offers and the evolution of this volume, the volume of job seekers and their evolution, the turnover rate, and also the share of long-term contracts. So they try to complete this information by making sure that these jobs are high quality, high reward jobs that are important for the economy. So in the end, I'm going to define a tightness indicators that is at the level of occupation in region, that is a composite index of all these 7 factors. And this will give me basically a measure that captures why these firms, this occupation were included in the reform. So my empirical strategy will rely on a measure of exposures. Since the occupations are, since my reform targets occupation, but I want to look at outcomes at the firm level, I'm going to treat a firm as more exposed based on the pre-reform tightness that is found within a given employment zone Z and a given sector for the treatment occupation. So basically, the most exposed firms are firms that are operating in sectors and located in areas where the shortages in these particular jobs were the most severe. And so the way I aggregate from a measure that is of tightness that is at the occupation in region is by weighting it by the employment weight of this particular occupation within the sector and the employment zone. And of course, all of this is done based on the pre-reform information, so using 2005 to 2007. So given this continuous measure of exposure, my estimation is based on a difference in difference with continuous treatment, which basically uses this exposure measure interacted with the post-reform period to evaluate the effect of the reform. But very importantly, I will have to include some controls. I control for tightness in non-reform occupations to make sure that I'm capturing really the reliance or the need for hiring workers in this particular list and not just tightness in general. And also given that we have the financial crisis in the middle, I want to make sure that I'm not using as an identifying source of variation differences across sectors, because we know that sectors were hit differently by the financial crisis. So I will include in my specification sector cross time fixed effect. And so in the end, my underlying assumption is going to be that firms that are located in the same sector, that are active in the same sector and located in employment zone that have in general similar levels of tightness, but different levels of tightness in this particular list of occupation would have evolved similarly in absence of the policy change. So this is my reduced form approach, and then to estimate a parameter that has more economic meaning, I do a 2SLS approach to recover some elasticity. So basically, I use the reduced form approach to estimate the effect of the reform on the first stage, so on employment in reform occupations, And then this is going to be the IV, the instrument is going to be the interaction between exposure and post-reform period. And then this predicted level of reform employment is going to be introduced in the second stage, where I estimate the elasticity of output and other inputs with respect to reform employment. So just a descriptive or unconditional evidence graph on the existence of the first stage before showing you my results. So here, I want you to focus first on the red line and on the solid black line. On the left graph, you have a total reform employment, and on the right graph, you have just the hiring of migrants within this reform occupation. And so the red line is going to show you the evolution. Everything is normalized to 1 in 2007, so you can look at the evolution pre and post-reform. And in red, you see the bottom 50 in the exposure distribution. So the firms that are less constrained in these jobs do not see much of an evolution in total reform employment over the period. You see a little bit of a decline in 2009, which is explained by the crisis, most probably. While if you see the top 50%, you see that they were following a similar trend ex ante, but then see an increase in the reform employment, which is basically explained by the fact that these firms were very much constrained on this occupation, and thanks to the reform, now they can access these jobs and they will hire more. And then on the right hand side, you see what happens only specifically to migrant hiring in these jobs, and indeed the effect on total reform employment seems to be driven by more migrant hired by these firms that were highly constrained before the reform. So this is just unconditional evidence. I do not control for anything, but give us a first indication that something has happened in the first stage. So firms that were highly constrained seems to have taken advantage of this reform. So if no questions up to this point, I'll show you the results from my main analysis, the one that I just presented. And if we have some time, I have two big robustness checks. The first one is that I use a slightly different identification based on a direct measure of demand shock. I will get into a bit more details later. And finally, very quickly, I have a similar reform that is introduced in 2006, and I check whether my identification give rise to similar results if I apply to this second reform, to make sure that basically what I'm picking up is not only driven by the particular context of the financial crisis. Okay, so I'm going to show you my reduced form results first in terms of event study graphs. And so you see the pre-trend, the estimated effect of the exposure measure on each year. So before the 2007, of course, we are hoping that not much is happening, given that I'm making the assumption that they were more and less exposed firms were following similar trends before the policy change. And then afterwards, we see what is the effect of the reform. So on the left-hand side, you have a graph on the log of the migrant employment in treatment occupations, the occupations of the reform. And on the right-hand side, you have the share of treatment employment within total employment of the firm. So this is measuring the first stage. It's trying to look at whether firms take advantage of the reform by hiring more people in these jobs. And indeed, it seems to be the case that there is a long-lasting positive effect of employment in reform occupation that is mostly driven by migrant employment. And then given that this is a continuous measure to get a sense of the magnitude, if we move from the 25th to the 75th percentile of exposure, we have an effect, an additional 1.1% migrant reform employment and an additional 3% in the share of reform occupation in total employment. Now I move to look at what happens to the second stage, the performance of the firms. The log total employment, so the size of the firm seems to be increasing, even if only marginally significantly. On the right-hand side, you have the effect on revenues, which also is positive and significant. Same for the value added, while for productivity, which I measure as value added per worker, you see positive tendencies, but is never significant. So this is the table of my results. The first two rows gives you the effect of the reform. So you have my exposure measure, tightness in reform occupation, and then I divide the post period into two periods, two sub-periods, so 2008, 2009, and 2010 and 2011, just to look at the immediate short-term effect and the medium-term effects. And then you have the controls for tightness in other occupation to make sure that what I'm picking up is really due to tightness in these particular jobs and not to everything else that might be happening in the same labor market. And indeed, you see again this positive and significant effect on total employment, revenues, and value added, and no significant results on productivity and two different measures of assets. While if you look at the coefficient on tightness in other occupations, it's either negative or non-significant. So it seems that I'm picking up something that is really specific to these jobs. In terms of the magnitude, again, I compute what is the effect of moving from the 25th to the 75th percentile of exposure. And the results are on total employment, for example, is about 0.8 to 0.9% increase as an effect. So all of these effects are small in magnitude, but in a way this is not really surprising because given all the fixed effects that I'm including this sector cross-year fixed effects. So the only thing I'm picking up is something partial. So it's not the full effect of the reform, but the effect of the reform after controlling for all of these dimensions. So I think the more meaningful results economically is going to be the analysis to pick up the elasticities of the main outcomes. So in this analysis, as I explained before, my reduced form approach is used to explain employment in reform occupation. Here in my main specification, I limit myself to log migrant reform employment because this is really the variable that I'm expecting to vary as a result of the reform. But I do some robustness tests also. Instead of using migrant reform employment, I can also use overall total reform employment, and the results stay the same. And what we see here is that an increase of 1% in the stock of employment in these jobs increases total employment by 0.5%, revenues by 0.6 or 65%, and log value added by 0.5%. So these are quite large elasticities, which basically tells us that these firms, because of the constraints that we're facing, they were really held back in terms of their growth potential, in terms of their revenues, their value added, etc. But on the other hand, maybe a bit surprisingly, I do not find any significant effect on productivity. Okay, so then I'm interested also in looking whether there is any crowding in of non-reform employment. On the first column, you see the total stock of non-reform employment within these firms, and I do not find any significant effect there. But if I disentangle, so I split total non-reform employment into the 4 different socio-professional categories, I see that there is a positive crowding in effect that is concentrated within executive jobs. So it seems that these highly technical occupations are somewhat complementary to other types of executive positions. And also, interestingly, even if there is a negative coefficient on blue-collar workers, is not significant. So there is, I do not find any crowding out for any other type of employment. Okay, so in this analysis, I also look at other outcomes. For example, I look at firm survival probability, and that I do not find any significant effect there. Maybe I can show you the heterogeneity analysis where I run the reduced form only in areas that are subject to low job-to-job mobility, which I use as a proxy for the dynamism of the area. These are less dynamic areas. And here I find that the effects are actually stronger. So here, for every outcome, you have the first column, the overall effect that I showed you before, and then the second column is the effect that is only restricted to these areas, labor markets with low job-to-job mobility, and same for revenues, value added, and value added per worker. And you see that the coefficient is greater, the magnitude is larger in the areas with low job-to-job mobility. And in the last two columns, you see what happens on my measure of productivity, which is value added per worker. And there, even if marginally, I do find a significant increase in productivity as a result of the reform in these particular areas. So indeed, it seems that in the areas that were really lagging behind in a sense that they were not very dynamic, they take advantage of this reform even more, and they manage to get some key workers that help them improve the level of productivity. And finally, I do some robustness by changing my definition of exposure. Instead of going at the employment zone level, I keep the larger regional level, which match the definition of the tightness of each occupation. And again, the results are fairly similar. So I guess I still have a little bit of time, so I can present you this robustness test using a direct measure of sectoral shocks. So this is just a very simple diagram that helps us a bit think about what's going on before the reform on the left-hand side. So you have labor demand, which is shaped in a normal way, and you have labor supply that is increasing constantly for the firms that are not constrained, while the labor markets firms that are in a situation of high constraints, basically, they face a labor supply that at some point get to a maximum, and then it becomes perfectly inelastic in a sense. So no matter how much wage increases, given that there are no more workers available with these competencies, the supply is somewhat fixed. So in this context, which is basically a representation of the situation prior to the reform, a labor demand shock will create an over response in terms of wages for firms that were highly constrained, and an under response in terms of employment, with respect always to the benchmark of firms that are unconstrained. And then what we expect as a result of the reform is basically that this unconstrained and constrained firms become more similar, because the effect of this reform is basically to relax the labor supply constraint, to increase the labor supply above the maximum, which basically reduces the difference in the wage and employment response. So the way, the strategy that I use to test this is that I need a measure, a somewhat exogenous measure of sector demand. And so I construct this praxis, which is basically a global demand shock at the sector cross time level, which takes an average, a weighted average of GDP growth of all countries except France. And the way it is constructed for every sector as a share, how much of each sector exports from France go to a specific country. So for an example, if we look at the GDP of Germany, the more the GDP of Germany grows, is going to be very important for the sectors in France that exports a lot to Germany, while the growth of a country that is very high and small will have a little impact. So to do that, I use data from the UN Comtrade, and the GDP comes from the WDI of the World Bank. So my identification is going to be my measure of global demand shock at the sector cross time level, interacted with the tightness, the exposure measure, the tightness in reform jobs. So my beta 1 is expected to be less than 0 if you look at employment, because as we said before, based on the diagram, we expect that a constrained firm underreact in terms of employment following a positive demand shock. And then the beta 3, which is the triple interaction between a shock, a sectoral demand shock, the exposure measure, and the post-reform period, we expect it to be positive for employment, meaning that the effect is getting closer to the unconstrained benchmark. And if we're looking at wages, of course, we expect the opposite, given that we expect an overreaction of constrained firm before the reform, and that the reform will bring them closer to the unconstrained situation. And finally, as I did for the first strategy, I use this reduced form as a first stage to estimate the predicted effect on tight employment, and then I use tight employment in the 2 SLS to estimate the elasticity of outcomes. So let me show you some results. This is the results on the first stage. On the first column, you have the effect on total reform employment. And you see the first row is basically the effect of a positive demand shock for firms that were more constrained. And indeed, you see that the reaction of this firm is lower. So the coefficient is negative, while the reaction in terms of wages, which is given in column 3, is positive. So this is what we expect based on the model. While if you look at the third row, which is the triple interaction between a demand shock for constrained firms after the reform, you see that this coefficient is positive, meaning that the difference in response in terms of employment is getting smaller. So the reaction is getting closer to the unconstrained case, while for the wages it is negative. Again, with the same type of interpretation. And then it's also interesting basically to compare the magnitudes. And given that 0.15 is about a third of 0.24, we can say that basically the reforms was able to shrink the difference in response by about 2/3 between highly constrained and less constrained firms. Similarly, if we look at the main outcomes, it seems that indeed, even in terms of total employment, revenues, and value added, firms that were highly constrained were able to react less to a positive shock in demand. So it seems that these constraints were really, again, holding back firms' capacity to grow in terms of both size, revenues, and also value added. Here I even have some slightly significant effects on intangible assets. And again, thanks to the reform, the reaction capacity to a positive shock becomes greater for these particular firms. And again, the magnitude seems to be about a third, about 2/3 of the first coefficient, meaning that the constraints are reduced by about 2/3. And finally, I can again compute this measure of elasticities, and I find magnitudes that are similar to my first strategy. So a 1% increase in reform employment induces a 0.5% growth in firm size, 0.5% growth in revenues, and value added. And here again, in this analysis, I find a positive effect that is slightly significant even on assets. And finally, maybe just one slide on the same approach using a 2006 reform. So here is the exact same approach as my first strategy. And this reform is similar in a sense that it removes these two exact same requirements, the one of extensive search for a native candidate and the one to prove that the occupation is in a situation of tightness. But it only concerns citizens that are coming from the new EU member states, which basically joined the EU in 2004, the Eastern Bloc in short. And the jobs that are included are of similar nature in a sense that they're a technical type of occupation, but they're more concentrated within blue-collar jobs, so specialized blue-collar jobs, so the less skilled than the main reform that I'm looking at. But here you see the reduced form on treatment employment, and indeed it seems to work in a sense that you have pre-trends that seems to hold and a positive reaction after the reform. And I show you again the elasticities here. My VALDEF statistics are a bit low, so something I plan to do is to correct my standard errors. But just qualitatively, it seems that the type of elasticity that I pick up are of similar magnitude. So about a 1% increase in this reform employment seems to trigger greater firm size by about 0.6% and greater value added by the same amount. So I'll just conclude. With this paper, I find that skill shortages in this particular context seems to be holding back firms' growth capacity. And this targeted migration policy seems to be an effective solution to relax the level of skill constraint. I do find an interesting crowding in of other types of skilled jobs and no crowding out. So it seems that the native labor force is not suffering very much from this increase in migration. And it seems that less dynamic areas are benefiting a bit more than the average. So that's all I wanted to show you for today. And thank you very much for your attention. Looking forward to the discussion. I'll stop my screen share so that you can go ahead and share your screen.
Thank you very much, Sarah. This is it's an honor to be able to discuss your work, and it's a very, very interesting paper. Let me just go ahead and share my screen as you suggested. And